This is for you, my shining light. May it make your journey a little happier." The brochure promised eternal companionship. It did not mention that eternal, in this context, included the strong possibility of losing a finger. Cordelia Ashwick had been running the Undead dating service, formally registered with the Greater Mortletch Chamber of Commerce as Holloway and Associates, romantic consultants for the post-living, for 11 years. In that time, she had successfully matched 42 couples, witnessed 14 engagements, attended 9 weddings, and filed 27 incident reports with the local constabulary. She considered this a reasonable success rate. Her insurance company did not share her optimism. The office itself was a narrow townhouse at the end of Sepulchre Lane, wedged between a taxidermist and a shop that sold nothing but extremely specific types of candles. The front door had been replaced twice, once after a werewolf, wrong demographic, long story, and once after a poltergeist who had been very clear about not wanting to be set up with just anyone, and had expressed this view by removing the door from its hinges and placing it neatly in the canal. Cordelia had fished it out herself. She was nothing if not resilient. On the door in tasteful gold lettering it read, HOLLOWAY and Associates, Romantic CONSULTANTS. Below that in slightly smaller letters, All species welcome. Below that in letters so small they required a magnifying glass, liability waiver required upon entry. Management not responsible for bites, possession, ectoplasmic discharge, or loss of limb. Emotional damage COVERED2, a maximum of 30 crowns. It was, Cordelia felt, a perfectly reasonable disclaimer. The trouble began, as trouble so often did, on a Tuesday. Tuesdays were intake days, which meant Cordelia sat behind her desk with her clipboard, her best professional smile, and the quiet, desperate hope that whoever came through the door would not require her to mop anything up afterward. She had learned, through painful experience, to keep a mop in the umbrella stand. The first client of the morning was a zombie named Gerald. Gerald had filled out his intake form in what Cordelia generously described as enthusiastic handwriting, and what her assistant Pip described as the aftermath of a particularly agitated spider falling into an inkwell. Large portions of the form were illegible. Some portions were missing entirely, along with 2 corners of the page, which Gerald had apparently eaten during the waiting period. He sat across from Cordelia now with the air of a man who was doing his very best and knew, on some level, that his very best was not quite what most people had in mind. "So, Gerald," Cordelia said, setting down the clipboard, "tell me a little about yourself. What are you looking for in a partner?" Gerald opened his mouth. What emerged was a sound that existed somewhere between a groan, a gurgle, and a philosophical inquiry. Cordelia had been at this long enough that she could parse approximately 40% of Undead vocalization. The rest she interpolated. "Right," she said, writing carefully. "Someone warm. Emotionally warm," she added, and underlined it twice, because the last time she hadn't specified, things had gotten awkward. Gerald made another sound. He held up 3 fingers. Then, after a moment's reflection, looked at his hand and appeared mildly surprised by the number of fingers present. "Deal breakers," Cordelia confirmed. "Excellent. Very healthy." She clicked her pen. "And what are they?" There followed 7 minutes of Gerald attempting to communicate his romantic preferences through a combination of groaning, gesturing, and what appeared to be interpretive swaying. Cordelia took notes with the focused expression of a woman who has made peace with the more baffling aspects of her career. By the end, she had determined that Gerald did not want someone who talked too much, did not want someone who was, and she was quoting the transcription charitably here, in a hurry about everything, and did not want someone who would, as best she could parse, make him feel embarrassed at dinner. This last one she circled and starred. "Gerald," she said carefully, "I want you to know that our service is completely judgment-free. But I do need to ask, what does dinner look like for you at the moment?" Gerald looked at the floor, then at the wall, then back at the floor. Then he made a sound that Cordelia had learned over years of professional practice meant he would very much prefer not to discuss it. "That's fine," she said, and moved on. the second client arrived at 10:30. Or rather, the second client had been in the office since approximately 8, having passed through the locked door without informing anyone, and had spent the intervening time rearranging the filing cabinet. Cordelia did not notice until she reached for the pending matches folder and found it had been moved to a shelf she could not reach without a step stool, neatly alphabetized by first name, cross-referenced by species and emotional availability, and annotated in a handwriting so immaculate it was clearly the work of someone with a great deal of time and absolutely nothing else to do. "You reorganized my files," Cordelia said. "They were wrong," said the ghost. Her name, according to her intake form, which she had completed entirely herself, in advance in triplicate, unbidden, was Marguerite Voss Halloway, deceased 1891, cause listed as a disagreement with a staircase. She was approximately 32 in appearance, luminously pale in the way that suggested either aristocratic breeding or the total absence of blood, and she had the particular energy of someone who had been dead for 130 years and had spent most of that time being deeply unimpressed by the living. "What was wrong with them?" Cordelia asked. "You were filing by surname. Any competent archivist files by species first, then emotional availability score, then surname. It reduces search time by 40%. I don't have an emotional availability score system. You do now." Marguerite produced a handwritten chart from somewhere inside her person, not from a pocket, from inside her person, which was one of the less troubling things ghosts could do and therefore barely worth mentioning. "I've assigned preliminary scores to your current active clients based on their intake forms and what I've overheard. You've been listening to my client meetings. I was here first." Delia took a breath. "Marguerite, what are you looking for in a partner?" Marguerite sat down in the chair across from her, which required the chair to pass through approximately half her lower body before she remembered to be solid. She settled herself. She folded her hands. She looked at Cordelia with the expression of a woman who has composed a 17-page answer to this question and is deciding how much of it the other person could reasonably absorb. "Intellectual stimulation," she began. "Patience. A willingness to maintain consistent room temperatures, as I am affected by ambient warmth in a manner that I find difficult to explain to those who have not experienced spectral thermoregulation. An appreciation for archival systems. Willingness to be read to. Willingness to be corrected. Ability to hear me when I speak, as some people cannot, which I find both personally offensive and statistically improbable given that I am clearly audible. Not allergic to cold. Not afraid of the dark, not in a performative sense. I mean genuinely not afraid because I am often in dark places and I would prefer a companion who could join me there without screaming." She paused. "Also," she added, "punctuality." "Right," said Cordelia, writing very fast. "I would also prefer," Marguerite continued, "someone who does not find it unusual that I occasionally walk through walls. I am not doing it to be dramatic. It is simply faster, of course. I would prefer they be capable of physical interaction, as the last 3 gentlemen your service recommended to me were entirely unable to touch me, which rather defeats the purpose." Cordelia looked up. "Were they ghosts too?" "No, they were just very polite Englishmen. The vampire came in at noon, which said something about him, though Cordelia was not entirely sure what. Most vampires came in at dusk, or after, or, in the case of one particularly dramatic count she dealt with the previous autumn, descended from the skylight at midnight with theatrical fog, and what turned out to be a portable fog machine he had concealed in his cape. This one arrived in full daylight, wearing what appeared to be approximately 14 layers of SPF clothing, an enormous hat, fingerless gloves, a scarf wrapped around most of his face, and the general demeanor of a man who had deeply miscalculated the distance between his home and the office. He unwound the scarf to reveal that he was, in fact, extremely handsome in the angular, ageless way that vampires tended to be, as if a portrait painter had depicted cheekbones as a person. He was also, Cordelia noted, slightly singed around the edges of his hat. "You walked here," she said. "It's only 4 streets," he said, with the dignity of a man who had nearly died twice to get here and intended to pretend that was fine. His name was Sebastian. He had been a vampire since 1743, which he mentioned was also the year Holloway and Associates had been founded, a coincidence he noted with such careful casualness that Cordelia strongly suspected it was not a coincidence at all. "Have you used this service before?" she asked. "Once," he said. "In 1891. Cordelia flipped back through her files. This took some time, as they were now sorted by a system she did not yet fully understand. She found 1891. She found Sebastian. She found the match notes. She read them. She looked up. "Sebastian," she said carefully. "Your 1891 match was listed as unsuccessful. The notes say the date ended when you attempted to dramatically reveal your nature at dinner, and the young lady in question had already deduced it from your lack of reflection in her soup spoon, leading to what is described here as a 40-minute argument about honesty." Sebastian looked at the wall. "She was very observant. The notes also say she threw the soup, had excellent aim. Further says that you described the experience as," Cordelia squinted at the handwriting, "a humiliation of the most profound and eternal variety, exceeded only by the time in 1756 when I attempted to woo a countess, and she informed me she found my brooding tiresome." Sebastian was quiet for a moment. "I've grown since then." "In what way?" He considered this seriously. "I no longer brood," he said. "I reflect. There's a difference." "What's the difference?" "Brooding," he said, "is passive. Reflection is active. When I brood, I sit in the dark thinking about the vastness of my suffering. When I reflect, I sit in the dark and think carefully about why things went wrong, take notes, and develop a corrective strategy." Cordelia wrote, "Still sits in the dark. Promising but complicated." "What are you looking for?" she asked. Sebastian leaned forward. He had clearly been thinking about this for some time, possibly since 1891, possibly longer. "Someone," he said, "who finds the eternal fascinating rather than exhausting, who does not require me to pretend to be something I am not, who will argue with me because I find agreement tedious but who will not throw soup, who can tolerate—" He hesitated. "Go on," said Cordelia. "Who can tolerate the fact that I take a great many things very seriously. Historically, people have found this intense. It does read as intense. I'm aware." He straightened his extremely singed hat. "I am working on it." Cordelia spent the remainder of the afternoon reviewing her files with the focused desperation of a woman who had accidentally taken on 3 clients who were each impossible to match, and was beginning to suspect the universe was testing her. Gerald wanted someone patient, unhurried, and forgiving of dinner-time peculiarities. He communicated primarily through interpretive groaning. He had eaten part of his own intake form. Marguerite wanted someone intellectually rigorous, physically capable of interaction, and unbothered by cold, darkness, or comprehensive filing systems. She had reorganized Cordelia's office without being asked and would almost certainly do it again. Sebastian wanted someone who found eternity fascinating, enjoyed debate, and would not throw hot liquids at him. He had walked through direct sunlight on the grounds that it was only 4 streets, which suggested either bravery or a complete absence of self-preservation instinct. Cordelia was not certain these were different things. She pinned their profiles to her board. She stood back. She looked at them for a long time, then she looked at them differently. "Pip," she called. Pip appeared in the doorway. Pip was 23, had been Cordelia's assistant for 2 years, and had the natural resilience of someone who had grown up with 6 siblings and a dog with a personality disorder. Nothing in the office alarmed Pip anymore. Pip had once calmly handed Gerald a napkin after an incident and then gone back to typing as if nothing had happened. "What do you think?" Cordelia said. "About a group introduction." Pip looked at the board. Pip looked at Cordelia. "You want to put a zombie, a ghost, and a vampire in a room together. Social gathering, low pressure, organic interaction. Time we did a group event, the poltergeist reorganized the furniture into a configuration the structural surveyor described as not architecturally supportable. That was different. Marguerite is not a poltergeist. Reorganized your filing system this morning. In a helpful way. Gerald ate the guest list at the last mixer. Was anxious. New environments." Pip looked at the board again. "What's your theory?" "Gerald needs someone patient. Marguerite has been dead for 130 years and is specifically good at waiting. Sebastian needs someone who finds the eternal fascinating and will argue with him. Marguerite has opinions about everything and is not afraid to voice them. And Sebastian, she stopped. Sebastian, she said slowly, has been alive since 1743. He has seen everything. He has an enormous amount of knowledge and absolutely no one to share it with who has the stamina to keep up. Gerald, she tapped the profile, Gerald cannot be rushed. Gerald will sit and listen to someone talk for hours. Gerald does not get bored. Gerald is, in many ways, the ideal audience. Pip was quiet for a moment. You want to set the vampire up with the zombie as a conversation partner and the ghost as an intellectual sparring partner, Pip said. I want to see what happens when three people who are all in different ways completely exhausting to be around are put in a room together. That's either brilliant or a disaster. Good things are, said Cordelia. Book the private dining room at the Velvet Sepulchre, Wednesday evening. And add to the reservation. No mirrors, ambient temperature below 60 degrees, and the kitchen is to prepare one meal that requires no chewing whatsoever. One meal that can be enjoyed in the absence of body heat, and one meal that is entirely liquid and may be served warm. Pip wrote this down without comment. This was why Cordelia paid Pip well above the market rate. Wednesday arrived with the self-satisfied punctuality of a day that knew it was going to be memorable. The Velvet Sepulchre was, by general agreement, the finest establishment in Mortlach for clientele who required certain accommodations. The lighting was deliberately dim, which suited everyone. The tablecloths were black, which was practical. The staff had signed an extremely comprehensive non-disclosure agreement, which was essential. The chef, a stout woman named Berta who had been cooking for unusual clientele since she was 17 and now simply got on with it, had prepared a tasting menu that addressed all three dietary requirements without making anyone feel self-conscious about theirs. Sebastian arrived first, because of course he did. He was wearing a very fine suit and had managed, this time, to travel after dark, which meant only his left hand was slightly singed, which he was concealing by keeping it in his pocket. He sat at the table and immediately began to study the wine list with the intensity of a man who had been alive long enough to have actual opinions about the vintage years. Marguerite arrived precisely on time, which she managed by passing through the wall of the building at 6 o'clock exactly, materializing at the table with the brisk efficiency of someone who did not believe in doors or small talk. She was wearing what appeared to be her finest 1891 evening dress, which was extremely beautiful and also slightly luminescent because ghosts. Sebastian looked up from the wine list. Marguerite looked at Sebastian. Reading the wine list in the wrong order, she said. I'm reading it by region. You should read it by vintage year. More informative. Disagree. Region tells you the character. Year tells you the luck. Marguerite sat down. That's an interesting distinction. It's the correct distinction. I didn't say correct, I said interesting. Sebastian put down the wine list and looked at her properly. What would you order? I don't consume wine, Marguerite said. I'm deceased. But if I did, I would order the 1887 from the eastern column, third from the bottom, which you can tell by the slight foxing on the page has been on this list since the establishment opened and has therefore either been there because no one wants it, unlikely given the price, or because the owner considers it their personal benchmark vintage and keeps it for special occasions. Sebastian looked at the wine list. He looked at the slight foxing on the page. He looked at Marguerite. You deduce that, he said, from a wine list. Had a great deal of time to develop observational skills. How long? 131 years. Sebastian was quiet for a moment. Then he said, with the tone of a man who is admitting something that surprises even him, that is the most interesting thing anyone has said to me in approximately 40 years. Gerald arrived at 6:15, which was, for Gerald, extraordinary. He had made an effort. This was visible in the fact that he was wearing a jacket, a significant achievement, and that he had, in what Cordelia would later describe as a touching gesture of social preparation, arrived with all of his original fingers, which were not always guaranteed. He sat down. He looked at Sebastian. He looked at Marguerite. He made a sound. Good evening, said Sebastian, because Sebastian had exquisite manners and applied them indiscriminately. Marguerite nodded. You're Gerald. Your intake form described your interests as, she paused, and Cordelia, watching discreetly from the corner table she had booked for exactly this purpose, nearly dropped her pen, walking, slow mornings, listening, and what the form described as being outside when things are quiet. You eat alone because dining with others creates pressure you find uncomfortable. She folded her hands. That is a very reasonable position. I also prefer quiet, and I am very good at being still. Gerald made a sound that Cordelia had learned to classify as surprised and pleased. I can translate, Sebastian offered, with the air of someone who had been dead long enough to have learned things that hadn't occurred to anyone to teach. He glanced at Cordelia. I speak some undead vocalizations. I've had a great deal of time. You all keep saying that, said Cordelia from her corner table, three heads turned toward her. Pretend I'm not here, she said. They turned back. Gerald made another sound. Sebastian listened. He says, Sebastian translated carefully, that he appreciates being in a room where no one is in a hurry. Marguerite looked at Gerald with the expression of a woman recalibrating. No one here, she said, is in a hurry. I have been dead for 131 years. He, she gestured at Sebastian, has been alive for 283. And you, Gerald, have presumably been dead long enough to understand that urgency is largely an invention of people who haven't thought carefully about time. Gerald made a sound. He agrees, said Sebastian. He also says he likes your dress. Marguerite looked at her luminescent 1891 evening gown. She looked at Gerald. Thank you, she said, in the precise tone of someone who does not receive compliments often and is not entirely sure what to do with them. From her corner table, Cordelia wrote, Progress. It was going remarkably well, which was, of course, the exact moment at which something went wrong. Berta the chef sent out the first course. For Sebastian, a glass of something dark and warm served in a crystal goblet with no further comment. For Marguerite, a plate of cold delicacies that could be appreciated aesthetically, which was all that she required. For Gerald, a dish that Berta had simply labeled very gentle, and which required no silverware, no effort, and no structural integrity. The incident occurred not with the food but with the adjacent table. A couple had been seated there, a perfectly ordinary living couple who had apparently not read the establishment's reputation carefully enough, or had, and thought the warning was metaphorical, or were simply the variety of people who sit down in a restaurant and do not look at who else is in the room until it is too late. The woman glanced up, saw Gerald, made a sound considerably less controlled than anything Gerald had produced all evening, and in the process knocked her soup directly into the lap of the waiter who was, at that exact moment, walking past Sebastian, hot soup, moving at velocity, directly toward Sebastian's extremely fine suit. Sebastian caught the bowl. Not the way a person with very fast reflexes would catch it. He was simply there, and then the bowl was in his hand and the soup was still in the bowl and it had not touched him. He set the bowl gently on the nearest surface. He produced a handkerchief. He handed it to the waiter. He sat back down. He smoothed his jacket. 300 years, he said, to no one in particular, and I have still not been allowed to simply eat dinner in peace. Gerald made a sound. He says, Sebastian translated, same. Marguerite, who had watched the entire incident with the calm of someone for whom physical chaos was not a primary concern, said, the soup was a burgundy base. If it had reached you, the stain would have been permanent. You had approximately 0.4 seconds. I know, said Sebastian. How did you know the trajectory? Experience. Much experience does one require to calculate soup trajectories. More than you'd think, said Sebastian. Less than you'd hope. Marguerite considered this. There is a mathematical model for liquid projectile arcs. I worked it out in 1923 during a particularly dull winter. Sebastian looked at her. You worked out the mathematics of soup trajectories. I had a great deal of time. You keep, Sebastian stopped, started again. In 1923, I was attempting to learn to paint. I was not good at it. I had also developed a comprehensive fear of soup due to an incident I prefer not to discuss. The date, Marguerite said. You know about that? Your file was in the archive. I may have reviewed it. You reviewed my file. I review everything. Sebastian looked at her for a long moment. What else was in my file? "Everything," said Marguerite, with a composure that suggested she had read every word twice and cross-referenced it with independent sources. Gerald made a sound. "He wants to know," Sebastian said slowly, still looking at Marguerite, "if this is what people mean when they say a conversation is going well." Cordelia in her corner wrote, "Surprisingly, yes. The dinner lasted 3 hours. Cordelia stayed for all of it because she was a professional and also because she had not eaten her own food and the chef had sent over a very good pie, and she was not leaving a very good pie." By the end of the first hour, Sebastian and Marguerite had argued comprehensively about the correct order in which to read a wine list, the mathematical precision required for projectile calculation, whether 1891 or 1743 had been a more epistemically interesting year to be undead, and the proper organizational schema for archival material. They had not agreed on any of it. They had, however, leaned incrementally closer to one another throughout the conversation in the manner of two people who found each other extremely contrary and were deeply fascinated by this. By the end of the second hour, Gerald had communicated, through Sebastian's translation, Marguerite's cross-referencing of intake notes, and a series of gestures that the three of them had developed into a working shorthand with the organic efficiency of people who are not trying, that he found the two of them easier to be around than anyone he had met since dying, because neither of them was in a hurry and neither of them required him to be more than he was. Marguerite had responded to this by sliding him a second portion of his very gentle dish without comment. Sebastian had responded by refilling Gerald's glass, even though Gerald had not asked. By the end of the third hour, they were arguing about cartography. Cordelia had stopped taking notes and was simply watching with the expression of a woman who had been doing this for 11 years and was finally, at last, watching something work the way it was supposed to. She paid the bill. She collected her coat. She stopped at their table on the way out. "Same time next week?" she asked. Marguerite did not look away from Sebastian. "The filing system," she said, "needs updating." "Bring the materials," said Sebastian. Gerald made a sound. "He says," said Sebastian, "he'll be there." Cordelia walked out into the night air of Sepulchre Lane, past the taxidermist, past the candle shop, past the small crowd of perfectly ordinary bystanders who had apparently followed the smell of soup, and were now pressing their faces against the restaurant window with expressions of deep bewilderment. She did not look back. She had an incident report to file. The soup situation had technically involved a projectile, and the liability waiver was very specific about projectiles. And she had 41 other active clients, and Gerald was still eating his intake form in small increments. And Sebastian would almost certainly arrive at next week's meeting singed again, because Sebastian was the kind of man who believed hope would eventually overcome physics. And Marguerite had reorganized the files in a way Cordelia still didn't fully understand and probably never would. But three people who had been alone for a very long time were sitting in a restaurant arguing about cartography, and someone had refilled a glass without being asked, and a plate had been slid across a table in the quiet language of people who are beginning to understand each other. Cordelia Ashwick put her clipboard under her arm and walked home. It had been, all things considered, a perfectly reasonable Tuesday. It had been a Wednesday. She was tired. Thanks for listening until the end. Please like and subscribe.